Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. We have another fantastic show for you today. We got a really great special guest with us today. Somebody I've talked to on the phone a million times, but he's actually in town, and we're going to have him live in our studio. David Shapiro here will be talking to us about African PTSD relief, but also about the notion of what is trauma, regardless of what is that trauma, and how do we process, how do we work with the traumas of our life. So we'll be talking about that in a second. And we're really glad, as I said, you're with us on Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry. And you can listen to these shows if you are lucky enough to be in Fairfield. And you could listen in live on KRUU 100.1 on your FM dial, 6:30 on Tuesdays, 6:30 p.m. on Tuesdays, and 12:30 on Thursday afternoons. But most people want to listen to them on the web. And to do that, you could go to the archives at KRUU, or you could simply go to the archive at ardentcenter.com. So www.ardent, A-R-D-E-N-T, CENTER.com, and you could go to the media tab and you could see them as videos on YouTube, podcast, all kinds of things, all different ways to listen to them. And also David will have some of these shows, especially the PTSD ones, on his site, African PTSD Relief, which he'll talk about right now. So David, welcome. We're so glad you're here. It's so great to see you in person live.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's really great to be here. We had a 12 or 14-part series maybe a year and a half ago, and we gave a little overview about how we started doing research into post-traumatic stress disorder. We talked about that inspiring research got us going, forming this organization, which is now 501c3. And then the projects across Africa, we interviewed a lot of people who are some victims of trauma. We interviewed experts, psychiatrists, psychologists, scientists who have measured it. We talked with people who have been helping reduce post-traumatic stress disorder across Africa and around the world. So we've kind of looked at things. But since I'm in town, and since there's been a lot of new news since then, I thought I would give a brief review about what we're doing, and then talk about all the wonderful new things that have happened since we talked last.
Fantastic. And we're also, again, I'm really intrigued not just by the research, but by the notion of reconceptualizing trauma and what do we do with it. So I'm so glad you're here. So David, take it away. So where do you want to start this?
We can start with your interest and your interest in trauma in general, and then we're going to look at actually historical. We'll quickly go over historically what we discovered. We have basically a new discovery of something that's effortless and extremely effective. Likely the most effective tool is completely effortless for reducing PTSD.
Okay, that's fantastic. And again, if you're in Fairfield, you probably know about this, but you might not know some other avenues of how to utilize the other ways that we're talking about here. So, David, where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with your main question, your first question. Let's look at what trauma is.
Okay, so what is trauma from your perspective?
From my perspective,
and you're dealing with people that have been traumatized. Let's get clear, in Africa, who have war-torn, as worse circumstances, poverty, war, the worst
sexual abuse, massive sexual abuse, reputed sexual abuse, and war-torn areas. They you can imagine the worst thing that could happen. People seeing death around them. They see, very unfortunate things to their family. The worst situations. And so basically a trauma in my mind is any negative event, any event that has a debilitating impact. Can have it's an event that's shocking to the nervous system.
Right.
Surprising, unexpected, and unwanted. At the time. Then the question is, how do we process that? What do we do with that? Do we sustain that impact and struggle with that for our whole lives, or do we use some method or some series of methods to get past that event and become stronger?
Okay, so two issues here, and I love how you're breaking this down. So first, what is trauma? Right? And clinically, what does it do to us inside? But also, So let me tackle part of that. So a lot of the ways people think of it, and this is a pretty simplistic way, is it gets trapped in your amygdala, where you get in that fight or flight. But actually, you could think about it as there's two different systems in the nervous system. There's the parasympathetic, which calms the nervous system, and the sympathetic, which hypes it up. If you're in the parasympathetic, actually that's where the freeze happens, by the way, and the numbing happens. So it's not always a good thing. And we're going to talk about applications in a little bit. So it's like that could be a terrible thing if you go into numbing or freezing during the headlights. The sympathetic is where you get in that fight or flight thing. Now, often this kind of trauma happens to us in big ways, small ways, where things are unexpected. And the more jarring, unexpected, and it goes into that kind of fight or flight or the freezing kind of stays there, that's where you get that PTSD reaction. So I deal with veterans all the time, for example. And if I'm a veteran, I am trained to shoot a gun. I'm trained that I am going to try and kill somebody, and somebody's going to try and kill me. That's to be expected. What's not expected, and that's what causes most people the trauma, is these things that I couldn't save my buddy. Somebody did something really strange. Something weird happened, which always happens. If I'm just living my life in Africa, and I'm in some village, and then this terrible war-torn thing, it's unexpected, and I can't process. And so we all have, for instance, relationships, and they break up. But sometimes even those kind of things could be like way over the top, and it's like, what just happened? I can't get my breath. It's like I can't catch my breath. What's going on? How do I deal with this? So all of us go through minor events throughout our lives, but sometimes it's so jarring that we get stuck in that freeze or fight or flight. And how do we get out of that? That's the trap. And so go on, David.
So as you were going to say, there's a series of classical experiences a person has with post-traumatic stress disorder that we've all seen in the movies. We know friends who have had this situation. First of all, in sequence, it's pretty happen, but the memory keeps coming up over and over and over again.
Right,
That's
and you can't let go.
The flashback. It's as you said, it's like the amygdala. It's the switch is turned on, and the amygdala you don't know how to turn it off.
You can't go to sleep also because
right.
As soon as you start relaxing, and this is part of the paradox, there's no way to actually let go. There's no way to relax.
So the switch is turned on. I say the switch is turned on. There's an active component. The person doesn't know how to turn off that switch. So that's the first thing that happens. Then a person, and that can also happen when one's sleeping, one can have these dreams in sleep.
Well, that's again why people don't sleep, and then they start trying to come up with maladaptive coping mechanism, like I'm going to start drinking, so because it makes me pass out. The problem is I don't sleep deeply. So if you ever try to drink to go to sleep or take a sleeping pill or something, the problem is it doesn't allow for depth of sleep, quality of sleep.
So these are beautiful points. And so the second thing that happens, first you have these experiences coming up, and then after they've gone a little while, then the person starts feeling separate, numb, separate from other people. They feel
we call that dissociation.
Emotional numbing. And so then that's the natural experience. You're overwhelmed inside, and you feel separate from people outside the way you used to. And then the next thing that would happen, you'd expect to happen, is you start feeling that negativity, that anger, that whatever that's experienced is that anger, negativity towards other people, perhaps, or also towards oneself. I'm not worthwhile anymore. I'm stressed. I can't function properly. The other people are whatever, and then it overflows into the last category of last description of PTSD. There's just major clusters of symptoms. The last cluster of symptom is where you have trouble. You try to adapt, or what part of it is trying to. It's how it overflows into activity. So you might take drugs, you might drink to try to hide from the pain, the discomfort, or you might do risky behavior or violent behavior. Anger might start welling up. You might even become violent. You have trouble sleeping. So these are the things that start happening in the body and behavior as this happens. And the thing about PTSD is it's not that you have some bad event, some unexpected, shocking event, and it's gone. You know, many people have that. They're in a car accident, they feel shaken for a few days,
Yeah.
and then they're better. But the way PTSD is usually measured is we wait 30 days till this event's gone, is done, and see how you're doing. If the body's normalized again, you're back to normal functioning, you don't have PTSD.
Right, you just had some acute stress.
That's right. You just had some acute stress. But if after a month after the event, if it keeps going and it gets even worse, then that's and it's a certain level of disturbance, which is significant, then it's often considered to be post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's right. And so again, just so everybody can relate, every one of us goes through bad experiences in our life. That's the nature of being alive. We go through these bad experiences, breakups, people die, things happen to us. We get money, and so even a joyous thing, we win the lottery kind of thing, well, that could be a stressful experience too, because now what do I do with that experience? And so it's, again, what do I do with change? And that's how comes people are so afraid of change. How do we adapt and learn to grow from change and be able to settle the nervous system down enough so we can process what's going on?
So there's one thing. One's the trauma, and the second part is stress. So we call it post-traumatic stress. Well, you don't have to have stress from trauma. That's your point.
Yes.
And so what we did is actually, I'm going to take a step back and explain how I got into this.
And who you didn't explain, by the way, that you're the director of this thing.
I'm the founding president of African PTSD Relief,
which is a very cool organization, by the way. Everybody, by the way, if somebody wants to check that out, where could they find that?
On the website, www.africanptsdrelief.org. African with an N, ptsdrelief.org.
Maybe you could give that again at the end, but thank you so much.
Yeah, and we will, as you said, we will put up this interview so people can listen to it.
Fantastic.
Later. So what were we? So
you were saying about it's traumatic stress,
right? So you have a very unexpected or surprising event.
Yeah.
And
you can't process
it.
Right.
So then you get overwhelmed. The system's overwhelmed, and it's as though a light switch is turned on inside, and you don't know how to turn it off.
Right.
So all these symptoms go on and on and on, and you get worn down from the inside. And PTSD is very special in the sense that just PTSD by itself is just basically pretty much just a mental disorder. There's very little physiological component to it. Over time, whenever you have stress, over years the system can wear down, and you can have high blood pressure. You can have a lot of other what's called comorbid conditions that go along with it. But by itself, it's fairly simple. It's basically just deep stress. And as you said, some people in the same event, you have a war going on. Some person sees an event, and he just doesn't think about it. And the other person sitting next to him sees the event, and he gets PTSD.
Well, if there was a fire here,
that's right,
I would be freaking out. Oh, my God, there's a fire. What do I do? Yeah. But the firefighter, he'd be running in the door. He'd like, oh, no. Here, go do this. Walk out here.
That's right.
He'd be calm and he'd be focused because he's in his element. He's trained. He knows what to do. It's not unexpected.
Right. But the other thing it's really important is that brings out another interesting point is that who can have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
So you think initially the big thought is veterans, people who are in war, civilians who have been in war situations. But actually, when we think about it, trauma can come anywhere.
Yes.
And actually, the fireman professionally is one of the people more likely to have PTSD.
Yeah.
Not because he's not used to it, but it's week after week and day after day, you're facing situations where
overwhelming stress
over and over and over again.
But there's also so many things that you're not expecting.
That's right. So it's also.
Oh my God! I was thinking that there wasn't really a big fire, and then all of a sudden the beams are coming down.
Something happened to some
kid is
child,
crying, and
you can't control it. And
no. So again, one of my tenets is that trauma isn't what happens to us; it's what we do to ourselves over and over again after the trauma.
How you process it. Yeah.
And I'm not processing it. Or with the fireman example, that's chronic stress. There's a difference between acute and chronic. Acute is like a one-time really bad experience.
Right.
Chronic is over and over for a long time.
Right.
And if you're in Africa dealing with this terrible war-torn situation, it's not going away. There's no sense to relief. There's no sense of a break where I can catch my breath and go, how do I deal with this?
In some situations, in some cases, we had refugees who were in a town.
Yeah.
Some soldiers came in. They did horrible things.
Yes.
And the people fled.
Yes.
So now they have these horrible memories of things happening to their family members, sexual abuse, and all these various things. They fled, and they were paralyzed still because although it was very short, they had an overwhelming response, and they couldn't get out of it. And
then they start doing it to themselves and each other over and over again.
That's right.
Even though they're safe, they're not safe because in their head, the monster's always there. By the way, you're listening to KRUU, Mental Health Matters, and 100.1 on your FM dial. Today, we have the great and famous David, head of PTSD relief. Am I saying that right?
Well, I'm the founding president. Actually, we have a new president now, Sabangali West.
Oh.
But I'm the founding president of African PTSD Relief.
Okay. So anyways, we're talking about, trauma is really what we keep doing ourselves. And the question is, how do we get out of this? Small traumas that we all go through that we can process sometimes better, sometimes worse. Some breakups, for instance, some are really bad, some are really not so bad. Okay, all right, deal with it. But it doesn't, we go through the small thing. Some things are so dramatic and so painful that they last a lifetime. And in fact, almost the next lifetime, and the next time. It's really fascinating dealing with Holocaust survivors, because what happens is that children get what's known as secondary trauma. This often happens with veterans. Yeah. So the veteran comes home, and then they, in a sense, traumatize their partner and their children.
That's right.
And get a secondary trauma.
Yeah.
And so you almost have like the rock falling in the small pond that's reverberating back and forth. And so, you've now escaped the situation. You're in a refugee camp. You're relatively safe. Relatively is the word to say.
Well, much
You've
more
been
because,
displaced.
it's
But I've lost my home. I've lost my life. I've lost half my family. These terrible things have happened. And so it keeps reverberating, not only within myself, but around me to other people. And then it keeps coming back to me again and again. And I keep,
that's right.
And I'm stressful to others, and they're stressful back to me.
So what we found, I was encouraged to test PTSD because we thought we had an approach that would be uniquely effective.
Okay.
So I gathered a group. I worked with some group in Africa and Uganda. We found Congolese war refugees. We divided them randomly into two groups. This is a study done with, I basically organized it. Dr. Fred Travis was the designer and statistician. Dr. Brian Reese was the expert on PTSD and PTSD testing for the military. And we basically designed a rigorous study. And we actually did the testing in 4 languages: French, Swahili, Lingala, and English. So because there were different groups who had who understood different languages, so it was a little bit complex. But we randomly assigned into 2 groups, and to our great surprise, the one group did nothing. It was just they just lived their life, and they showed no change whatsoever. This is a group that was selected for already having high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, using a standard tool that's used across the United States and and around the world.
Yeah.
So the group that did nothing showed no change because it's a chronic problem. The group that we tried an approach of transcendental meditation, and we found that within 30 days, using this paper test, over 90% of the group with PTSD, high levels of symptoms, became non-symptomatic. And we thought this is astounding, that something that's a chronic problem that otherwise can have a lifetime are now free of PTSD. And so we tested again at 135 days, and we found even another slight drop in symptoms for the group that did Transcendental Meditation, or TM. And the control group, their symptoms went up a little bit because they were in a little bit of a tough environment.
Again, that secondary trauma keeps
That's right,
reverberating.
secondary trauma.
Yeah.
So that was what that study catapulted us into seeing that there was something that could be done to help.
And this is solid research. So
yeah, this is
published
published
some people know some of the research out there is not as solid. This is pretty clean, solid research.
Yes, it is. It's
and those are really good people. I mean, I know Fred, for instance, is as solid of a person as you can get.
Yeah. So basically, that was published. We had 2 studies published that in the Journal of Traumatic Stress, which is a top journal. The top journal on traumatic stress.
Absolutely, I've been to their conferences.
Yeah, and actually, we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah,
I just came back from one of their conferences. But so they published 2 studies, and what was interesting to me is that one of the reviewers in the second article we published, this is very unusual. The reviewer basically said, "Thank you so much for doing this research. There's such a great need." And this is for a reviewer who's supposed to be scientific and objective.
Yeah.
They were so moved by the results because when you look at the results from psychotherapy, when you look at the results from other approaches, from our evaluation, it doesn't seem to be as effective.
Yeah, and I think I've found that working with people for a long time that. Again, think about what we're trying to do. We're trying to get rid of the stress. We're not being cosmic here. We're not trying to enlighten people. We're just trying to get basic people to a level of functionality and to change that nervous system so that you can process those signals, right? Get out of this trap of the sympathetic nervous system on overload and the parasympathetic system shutting down, essentially. That, again, getting out of the amygdala and the fight or flight kind of mechanisms and on and on. And so it's really is literally transforming the nervous system. It's calming down the brain signals so the neurons are firing a little bit more focused.
Yeah, and there are 10 published studies now on TM, Transcendental Meditation for post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of them are on veterans because that's a very hot topic right now. There's a huge concern for U.S. veterans. 20 to 23 veterans commit suicide every day. That's over 8,000 U.S. veterans commit suicide, most of it due to post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. So, and that doesn't include the veterans who are abusing their spouses or their children, who are drinking, who are dysfunctional, who are homeless. So the effect is horrible on veterans. It's also really tough on first responders like your firemen.
Yeah, right. But what's really interesting is again the cost effectiveness of something like this.
That's right. It's both a very effective and cost effective. And what's important
because you could not get a team of psychiatrists to go down there.
No.
First, even if you could, what would they give people?
Yeah.
Doing talk therapy, which I do, by the way, every day, isn't enough to shift that nervous system.
It's very interesting. I was thinking we were going to go in a different sequence, but this is a really good way to put it. When I went last November to the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies for their annual meeting. And they have world leaders in world experts.
It is the top organization.
Yeah,
by the way.
keynote speakers. 2 of the 3 keynote speakers were from World Health Organization. One of them had, who actually I talked to afterwards, Dr. Ronald Kessler from Harvard.
Oh, I've read his stuff.
Yeah, and so I've read some of his stuff too afterwards. But at the time, he was giving a presentation on he is the chief administrator and designer, I believe, for the Global Mental Health Survey that World Health Organization does.
That's as big as you get.
That's as big as they get. They've actually measured in 30 of the countries in the world, And he was going over the methodologies and focusing it in terms, although they do a wide range of testing, he was discussing it in terms of post-traumatic trauma and stress, which are in post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And he was saying that the degree, the level of PTSD in different countries around the world and different continents, he'd done measurements and all that. And at the end, I walked up to him and said, Dr. Kessler, I see that you've done so much in South America and Asia and Europe, but you didn't mention anything about Africa. He said, well, we've only done 2 countries in Africa out of 54 countries. I said, well, I'm glad to work with you. He said, fine. Why don't we work together on that? So, and since then we've had some interactions, and so basically this is a forum for meeting the world leaders and seeing how they're thinking, seeing what's being done. And I think it's I learned some very interesting things from that meeting. One of them is that you asked the question, how do you handle large problems in very large groups in areas of the world where there's little money to support it, right? Well, that was one of the major topics that another man brought out the next day. He said his angle was very interesting, and you really see how the leaders think. So anyway, his thinking was very practical. He said, well, we have a continuum from doing a very rigorous, what they're talking about, what they're aware of. They're aware of psychotherapy, which has a certain, it's very labor intensive. It has a certain degree of effectiveness. They're aware of even internet based, and you can train a layperson to help to say some things to help a person feel better.
Absolutely. So there's been great studies in India on that, for example.
Yeah, and there's a wide range of things that can be done from very complex to very simple. And he said basically their formula is to figure out how much it's accomplished per person and how much money it costs, and they try to balance it out to do very large groups for as little money as possible.
Right.
Cost benefit analysis, which they're doing.
Yeah.
So he's favoring doing less, but helping very large groups. And then the issue is, can we bring in something else that will do maybe a little more than what the minimum they're doing, but really help a lot more? Can we do something that produce more cost benefit than they're doing now?
Absolutely, and I think that really becomes the point. Is I think just being pragmatic, even if you've got the top resources available, it's sometimes really incredibly difficult. The medications given are not the most effective. They won't necessarily stop the trauma, and it won't change the nervous system in a way which will actually create the long-term benefits. It'll mask the problems, like opioids will mask the symptoms for a while. EMDR and hypnosis, for example, I do those, are very, very useful tools. And they can be incredibly effective. But again, incredibly labor intensive and often not appropriate for everybody on a mass scale. And it, again, might change your mindset, but maybe not the initial internal reactions. And so how do I get everything to click? How do I create a bigger thing? So we're going to end here in a moment, and we're going to do another show here, right? All right. So what do you want to say to finish up today?
Well, I just encourage you to, what we're going to be talking about and what our organization does is we do very effective research. We actually use transcendental meditation, and we found it seems to be the most effective tool, which can be used with other tools, but by itself it's extremely effective for reducing PTSD. And
again, where can they find out more about this again?
www.africanptsdrelief.org.
AfricanPTSDrelief.org.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, David. I'm so glad you're here with us, and we'll look forward to the next show next week listening on this. Thank you so much. Bye.